One of my favorite anecdotal stories is the one about the little boy who missed church on Palm Sunday. It was a Sunday on which they were doing a live reenactment of Jesus riding in Jerusalem. Well, his little brother came home after church and said, "Oh man, you missed it. It was awesome." Said, "We had a parade and we got to wear clothes and we waved palm branches, and then Jesus came riding in on a donkey." To which the older brother replied, "Oh shucks, the one Sunday I miss and Jesus shows up." Well, what if Jesus did show up? What if we heard there was a huge parade coming down Germantown Parkway, and that at the center of that parade was Jesus of Nazareth riding in an old used Chevrolet Impala? And then we heard that that parade had turned off Germantown Parkway and was headed down Farmington Boulevard, and was going to go from Farmington on to West Street and would come right in the front of Germantown United Methodist Church. What if we heard that a parade was here in Germantown and Jesus was going to ride by our church? We would flock here. We would fill every parking space. We would rush to find every blade of grass on which we could stand and every piece of asphalt on which we could stand in order that we might see him. We would be willing to stand 2 to 3 deep, wouldn't we? If we could stand out on those sidewalks or all over at the Oleg, stand out in our parking lot and see Jesus come our way. Now, we might not sing Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, but we would be shouting and we would be celebrating and we would be joyfully proclaiming that we got to see Jesus when he came our way. Now, you do remember what happened that first Palm Sunday. That those who were shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord on Monday, were shouting, crucify him on Friday. That those who were celebrating his coming as he rode in on that donkey on that first Palm Sunday were condemning him on Friday. That those who couldn't wait for him to come as the Messiah on Sunday couldn't wait for him to die on Friday. Now, you know what we'd say, of course? We'd say, well, we're much more spiritually sophisticated than that. We're far too spiritually mature to go so easily from celebrating to condemning. That's what we'd say, wouldn't we? We modern folk are far too sophisticated, far too spiritually mature to leap so readily from celebrating to condemning. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. Let me tell you why. Because the buttons of discontent that Jesus pushed in the lives of those first century Jews and Palestinians are the same buttons of discontent he would push in. The same things that riled those first Jews and Palestinians on that Holy Week are the same things that would rile you and me if Jesus came into our midst and confronted us with them. Let me illustrate. He would push us beyond our comfortable and convenient religion. Once Jesus got out of that Chevrolet Impala and he had to talk to you and me, guess what? He would say to us, "You've got to move past, folks, your comfortable and your convenient religion." You realize the first public thing that Jesus did, according to the Gospel of Mark, after the parade, is that he stormed into the temple and he began to overturn the table of the money changers and to run them out of the temple. And according to the Gospel of Matthew, he even used a whip. So the first public thing that Jesus does once he rides into Jerusalem is to storm into the temple and overturn the tables of the money changers and begin to run them out of the temple. And one Christian scholar says that what Jesus was doing on that day was reminding them that their religion had become a self-serving religion, that it had become a comfortable religion on their terms. You know the name Max Lucado? Max Lucado was a wonderful Christian thinker, writer, pastor. He says that we modern folk are me-centric. He says this: we want weather that pleases us, traffic that helps us, a government that serves us, a religion that consoles us. Hear that again. We modern me-centric Christians want weather that pleases us, traffic that helps us, a government that serves us, and a religion consoles us. Somebody else has said, we want worship on our terms. We want church commitment on our terms. We want Christianity on our terms. We even want God's obedience on our terms. Any of us deny that? Well, Jesus would get out of that Chevrolet Impala and he would say, folks, I'm going to be honest with you. That doesn't fly. That's not going to get it. Religion on your terms is not what my faith is about. Doing things the way you want to do them, having work on your terms and commitment on your terms and the Christian faith on your terms and obedience on your terms is not being faithful to me. And we would not be pleased when he confronted us with our comfortable and convenient religion. Secondly, he would call us beyond our conceptions of grace. He would call us to move beyond our conceptions of grace. I said 2 Sundays that the most popular hymn in Christianity is the hymn Amazing Grace. And I told the story about John Newton, who wrote that hymn, who was a slave trader. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. We love that hymn, don't we? We love the story that God has this wondrous, amazing grace that's available to each of us. We love the idea that in spite of ourselves, God's mercy and God's grace is available to us. We love that. But you know what we tend to do? We tend to confine for whom grace is available. We can tend to restrict those for whom we think grace should be available. In Jesus' time, it was the way the Jews viewed the Gentiles. The Jews didn't think the Gentiles deserved the same love of God they deserved. They didn't think the Gentiles deserved the same mercy of God they deserved. They didn't think the Gentiles deserved the same grace of God they deserved because they considered the Gentiles irreligious, immoral, and ungodly. And you say, we wouldn't be that way. How about people with different lifestyles? How about people who have morally different lifestyles than you and me? Do we afford them the same grace that we want God to afford us? I hear constantly Christians, and I read this online, I see it in blogs, how often Christians are putting down those who have lifestyles different than our own, and how easily we exclude them from the same grace that we so readily claim for ourselves. How about somebody with a different religious perspective or coming out of a different religious tradition? Well, thanks be to God for the grace that's available to me, but I don't want that same grace available to somebody who has a different religion or a different religious perspective. Or there's somebody who has a life behavior that we really consider wrong. Oh, we're ready to claim the grace for ourselves. We're not so ready to extend the grace to them. You know what Jesus would tell us? He said, guess what, folks? You don't get to define the boundaries of God's grace. You don't get to decide to whom God extends his grace. You don't get to determine the breadth of God's grace. If he loves you, he loves others. If he extends his grace to you, he extends his grace to them. And it would not go well with us, for the most part, when Jesus confronted us with our tendency to define grace for ourselves and exclude that grace for others different than us. Third thing, he would call us to a radical lifestyle. Jesus would call each of us to a radical lifestyle. I think you know that the primary teachings of Jesus are found in Matthew 5 through 7. It's known as the Sermon on the Mount. I think you're aware of it. And if you've not sat down and read through Matthew 5 through 7, I invite you to do so because there are the core teachings of Jesus. They have been called, the Sermon on the Mount has been called a counterculture lifestyle. It's been called a radical way of living. And they are the central teachings of Jesus. Well, the best summation that I've ever heard of the Sermon on the Mount was written by a 19-year-old, listen to this, written by a 19-year-old in 1968. The best summation of the Sermon on the Mount was written by a young man at Harvard College in 1968. It's called The Paradoxical Commandments. Listen to this. People are illogical, unreasonable, and self-centered. Love them anyway. If you do good, people will accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Do good anyway. The good you do today will be forgotten tomorrow. Do good anyway. Honesty and frankness make you vulnerable. Be honest and frank anyway. The biggest men and women with the biggest ideas can be shot down by the smallest men and women with the smallest minds. Think big anyway. People favor underdogs but follow only top dogs. Fight for a few underdogs anyway. What you spend years building may be destroyed overnight. People really need help but may attack you if you do help them. Help people anyway. Give the world the best you have and you'll get kicked in the teeth. Give the world the best you have anyway. You see, when Jesus comes to us, he says to us, I'm calling you to a counterculture way of living. I'm calling you to step out and live differently than the world. And unfortunately, far too many of us are living like the world rather than different from the world. Let me close by saying this. You and I must understand that Jesus knew he was riding to his death. Jesus knew that in spite of all the acclaim, in spite of all the celebration, to the thousands lining the roadway into Jerusalem or lining West Street, that he was riding to his death. He knew that his teachings would not over well. He knew that those who would hear his message would be riled by it. He knew that he was riding on that donkey toward his death. You and I must understand that Jesus of Nazareth accepted the cross. He chose to die. It was not imposed upon him. And no one puts it better than William Barclay when he writes, Jesus' death was entirely voluntary. Jesus wasn't like some animal dragged to the sacrifice. Jesus voluntarily laid down his life because he chose to do so. It is clear to the end that he could have turned back and saved his life. He did not lose his life. He gave it back. He was not killed. He chose to die. The cross was not thrust upon him. He willingly accepted it for us. Why did Jesus go to the cross? Why was he willing to get off that donkey, encounter the folks of Jerusalem, and walk to Golgotha on Friday? Let me tell you why. Because he believed that the love of God for all humanity was worth dying for. He believed that God's desire for all persons to be treated as children of God was worth dying for. He believed that love replacing hate was worth dying for. He believed that God's plan for all sinners to receive God's grace was worth dying for. He believed that each of us, all of us, are worth dying for. So when he pushed their button, and when he pushes our buttons, when he calls us to push beyond our comfortable and convenient religion, when he calls us to expand the boundaries of grace rather than restrict the boundaries of grace, and when he calls us to a counterculture lifestyle, he knows that the human response is to be riled. And that in the end, that life, that commitment is a sacrificial one. On this Palm Sunday, may you and I understand what the Lord Jesus asked of us. And may we understand the price that he paid, that that message might get through to you and might get through to me. Thanks be to God.